morning, everyone, and welcome to the 16th Annual Grants Training Seminar entitled Budgeting and Planning, Improve Grant Proposals and Accountability. I'm Michelle Sullivan with the College of Southern Maryland. We're excited for the day with you and think that you are going to thoroughly enjoy and get a great deal from our terrific speaker. Please note that this is being recorded and will be available for on-demand viewing. We're going to send all of you the PowerPoint handouts and a survey, and we sincerely hope that you'll fill out the survey for us, as it really helps us inform what future grants training workshops will look like. So thank you in advance for doing that. I'd like to take a moment as well to thank our co-sponsors, the College of Southern Maryland, the Maryland Governor's Grants Office, and the Charles St. Mary's and Calvert County Library System. We usually hold this training at the college's La Plata campus, but Zoom is allowing us to reach many of you who would be unable to attend in person, including our speaker today. So by way of background, the NonProfit Institute works with nonprofit organizations throughout Southern Maryland, helping to enhance their effectiveness and achieve success in fulfilling their missions. The NonProfit Institute provides many programs designed to meet organizations' interests and needs, including training classes and workshops, collaborative community calls, special interest group meetings, and networking opportunities. We also provide operational advice and insight, one-on-one consultations, resources to help guide your work, and an annual conference. And we'd like to invite you to save the date for the 2022 Annual NonProfit Institute Conference, which is going to take place on April 28th, 2022. We also are offering 2 fall classes that may be of interest at a reduced rate of $35, which is a true bargain for the deep dive taken by our instructors. And those are Building an Exceptional Board, and that's going to be on Thursday, October 14th from 9 to 12:30, and Putting Polish into Your Marketing Program on Tuesday, November 9th from 9 to 12:30. Now I would like to introduce a few people who are with us today. My NonProfit Institute colleagues, Kara Fogarty and Amy Davis, as well as Kyle Keebaugh, Assistant Director of Strategic Initiatives in the Division of Learning. And we want to wish Kyle well, as this is his last day on the job at CSM before he moves on to a new position. Jennifer Colton, the director of the Maryland Governor's Grants Office, is not going to be able to join us today. So my colleague, Kara Fogarty, will be sharing welcoming remarks from Jennifer. Kara?
Hello, good morning, everyone. Jennifer sent her regrets, but sent me a note and asked if I would please read her remarks on her behalf. She says, good morning and welcome. Due to a last-minute shift in availability, I am unable to deliver remarks directly, but I hope that you will enjoy the training that has been prepared for you today. As the director of the Governor's Grants Office, I truly enjoy engaging with and learning from the nonprofit community. Your projects are an invaluable contribution to the community, and thank you for all you do. The Governor's Grants Office does recognize that these efforts do have its challenges, and we have been working hard to improve grants management practices across the state in several ways. One of those ways is through the Maryland Efficient Grants Council, otherwise known as the Mega Council. During the 2020 general legislative session, a bill was passed requiring the creation of this council for the purposes of identifying and recommending opportunities for improvement in grants management across the state. As the chair of the council, and with the help of the members, several of whom represent the nonprofit sector, we are reviewing grant management practices, challenges, policy issues, and opportunities for improvement, and we'll be presenting our first report on our efforts to the General Assembly by the end of the year. Additionally, our office is overseeing a major IT project to bring an enterprise grants management technology solution to the state of Maryland. We are in the final stages of the procurement process, so much of the current status cannot be discussed, but there will be an announcement and additional information to be shared hopefully by the end of the year. I, Jennifer, will be sure to share any opportunities to learn more about this effort with the Nonprofit Institute. And you can always learn more about the Governor's Grants Office through our website at grants.maryland.gov. The website is wrapping up migration to a new platform, which will be much prettier and easier to use. So check back frequently for more information and ways to stay connected. And lastly, I want to thank the Nonprofit Institute for their consistent delivery of valuable training opportunities, which, as you all know, help to increase the capacity throughout the nonprofit community and provide a forum for collaboration, networking, and idea sharing. And this is kind of weird for Kara to read, but it says, Kara, you and the team, the presenters are incredible. Thank you for everything you do. Jennifer.
Thank you, Kara.
Sure.
Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Janet Kazuko Storms. Janet's knowledge of the budget process encompasses not only direct budgeting experience as a member of the U.S. Senate Appropriations Committee's senior professional staff, but also as a nonprofit financial officer with the nonprofit Radio Free Asia, and teaching experience involving the development and teaching of courses on the federal budget process. She's also president of Learning on the Verge, LLC, and we are so pleased to have Janet with us today. Without further ado, Janet.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm actually in Colorado, so it's morning my time. So if I accidentally slip up, please let me know. But I'm thinking it's after 12 your time, so good afternoon. And thank you for joining me today. I'm very excited today to have an opportunity to talk about the connections between your organization's budget process and applying for grants and how to improve accountability. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So let me just take a moment to do that because I do have a PowerPoint. And it'll just take me a second here. And I'll bring this over. Okay, so hopefully you can see this pretty clearly. If you can't, please let me know. So let me there we go. Before we get started, I do want to just mention a few housekeeping items. My understanding is this workshop is for 3 hours, so we'll go till around 2 o'clock, give or take, depending on the Q&A and chats and all of that. We will have a couple of breaks throughout the afternoon, 2 10-minute breaks, so that you have a chance to get away from the screen and sort of rest your brain a little bit and think about what we've been talking about. Also, to give you an opportunity to, I know it's so difficult in Zoom to really do sharing with the other colleagues you have here, the other participants. We're going to do 2 breakout sessions. I will give you sort of an exercise to do, but I hope also it gives you an opportunity to get to know each other and have a chance to do some collaboration. In terms of questions, I welcome questions and I hope that this becomes more of a dialogue. And so I'm going to invite you to type into the chat. I will try to answer the questions as they come up, but I will also make sure to allow time at the end so that we can have a fuller discussion about any questions maybe that I didn't cover, or things that after you've heard the whole presentation, you might want to have an opportunity to discuss with me and with the other participants. So please feel free to use the chat, and I am going to ask Michelle to help me monitor the chat and so that I can catch that. Now, unfortunately, because of the size of the group that we were that have registered, I won't be able to ask you to introduce yourself individually, but I would like to invite you to share with the group if there's one thing you're hoping to get out of this workshop today, what is it? And go ahead and type those into the chat. And if those ideas come up throughout the day, that's fine too. But it's always interesting for me to know, and it also helps me to modify a little bit to know what your interests are. So if you do have things that you're interested in, please feel free to type that into the chat as well. So you may be wondering, what am I going to be covering today? So the first thing we're going to spend some time on is, what is the purpose of a budget? Each of your organizations has a budget process, but I don't know that every organization has really thought about the impact of their budget process on their operations, on their programs. So we're going to talk a bit about that. And then I will talk about strategic budgeting, which is my term for this integration of strategic planning with the budget process. And I'll talk about sort of the model that I've developed and talk about tools. And I think the tools, we're not going to unfortunately have a chance to actually practice a lot of the tools, but I'm going to go through and explain them. And because I think the tools really help to understand how you actually implement this. How do you actually go about getting this done? And then I'm going to tie it back to, how does improving, changing your budget process lead to stronger grant proposals and increased accountability, and also streamline the whole process. And then obviously, as I said, we will have a Q&A and discussion session at the end. So my goal in this seminar is to give you an opportunity to think about your organization's budget process and ways to adapt it so that your budget process actually supports your organization's needs. And so I hope that this will be helpful. I'm not at all, and I just want to make this clear at the beginning, I'm not at all proposing that you throw out the budget process you currently have. No. What I'm asking you to do is just take these couple of hours to really think about ways of maybe modifying, changing, introducing some of these tools that will help strengthen your budget process so that it does serve and support your organization's needs. So, as I said, the first thing we're going to talk about is, what is the purpose of a budget? It's probably, for many organizations, just sort of evolved organically out of necessity. And those who are involved in it, it may be a very limited number of people that maybe even understand or know what your organization's budget process is. But I'd like for you to just sort of think about it. In my mind, budgets are the way organizations and governments and any entity resolve competing demands for limited funding, competing demands for limited resources. Because if you think about it, only those programs, those policies that get funding get implemented. So the budget process should be a way to discuss those competing demands and resolve them in ideally a fair and transparent way. Now, I really like this. The National Advisory Council on State and Local Budgeting came up with this definition of a mission for the budget process. And I like it a lot, and I'm going to just read it. It says, it should help decision makers make informed choices about the provision of services and your capital investments, and to promote stakeholder participation in the process. Now, the reason that I like this definition is because it recognizes that there are absolutely decision makers in the budget process. Those individuals, the board, whoever it might be in your organization, with the responsibility to make the final decision. But it recognizes that they need information, they need data, they need to understand the full context so that they can make good choices. And that stakeholder participation is key in terms of getting the informed choices. So I feel like this mission puts the budget process in a slightly different context than maybe what you thought about it. It may have been something that's all just numbers driven. It may have been something that limited number of people do, but really it is about making these informed choices within the limited resources that you have. Now, the council also identified what are the characteristics of an effective budget process. And I think these are valuable. It should be strategic in nature. It shouldn't just be about this current year. It should be about longer term, about looking at how do we achieve our strategy. So strategic in nature, encompassing multiple years, not just of your financial plan, but your operating plan. What is it that your organization wants to achieve this year, next year, and maybe 2 or 3 years out? That the budget process should allow and facilitate the decisions about allocation of funds based on the goals that your organization has identified. Meaning it moves beyond what we call line item expenditure control. And you may be thinking, what does that mean? That's basically tracking your budget to see how much you spend on salaries, how much you spend on office supplies, how much you spend on whatever other types of costs you might have. And it goes beyond that to ask the question, are we achieving our goals? Are our resource allocations helping to support achieving our goal? It also ideally provides some flexibility to managers, to those who are working on those programs, on those projects, to allow them to respond to maybe unexpected demands or unexpected requirements, to give them some level of flexibility and for them to know what that flexibility is, ideally leading to better programs, more effective programs, and a more efficient program. Now, I just noticed that there are a couple of chats, so I just want to pull them up right now. So it's Rosanna asks, how to scale up when we've had a big hit on our budget because of a loss of a high capacity donor due to COVID. Rosanna, that is exactly what it's, in fact, it's one of my examples later on of how these tools can help your organization begin to strategize. How do we, a significant loss of funding, or maybe a significant increase in demand of your services. Hopefully, some of the tools I'll give you will enable you to not just respond immediately, but say, okay, let's look at this. So terrific point. And Emily says, clarity, matching budget to needs. That is exactly right, Emily. Yeah, that is what we're trying to look at here. How can an organization's budget process, part of the process, be making sure it matches your needs? And do you know what your needs are? That is often the even bigger question, and we will even look at that. So thank you, both of you, for those comments. Okay, So ideally, a good budget process provides a transparent way to prioritize your organization's challenges and issues and solutions, the programs, the policies that you decide to pursue. It enables your stakeholders to have a voice, and a voice at appropriate times in the budget process, and we are going to talk about that. Focuses on developing realistic, actionable plans that help you develop budgets that are realistic and help you tie your budget, your resources to those things you need when you need them. So, and then figuring out how much money you need, when you need it, and then ultimately evaluating those actions, because I believe evaluation is actually part of budgeting, because evaluation helps you to improve, refine next year's budget. Maybe a program isn't reaching the goal, looking at why, evaluating it, and then figuring out what you do. They should be part of the full budget process. So I've been talking a lot about stakeholders. And again, I'm coming back to the National Advisory Council on State and Local Budgeting. Now, I will recognize this is actually government budgeting, but I absolutely believe and have found that these principles hold true for organizational budgets as well. That the budget process should accomplish the following: involve stakeholders, identify stakeholder issues and concerns. Now, this third one to me is interesting. It says obtain stakeholder support for the overall budget process. I want to point out, it doesn't say get stakeholder approval of your budget decisions, but by sharing how you are going to make decisions, involving them in the right points throughout the process, they can then, educating them, helping them to understand what your organization is faced with, will help you garner their support for your budget decisions and your processes. And then that leads into the fourth one: achieve stakeholder acceptance of your organization's decisions as it relates to the goals you decide to pursue, the services you've decided to deliver, the programs you're going to develop, and how you're going to use your resources. Ultimately, once you, at the end of each year or whatever makes sense to you, reporting back to your stakeholders on the impact of those services, those programs, and how you actually did utilize the resources. All of these ultimately will enhance your stakeholders' view of your organization. So by involving them in the appropriate places, by educating them, by reporting back to them, and will help to strengthen the view, the reputation of your own organization. So I believe that in order to for an organization to establish trust, instill confidence in grantors, donors, volunteers, your clients, organizations must include the stakeholders in a meaningful and organized manner in the budget process. Now, the council sort of closed their discussion on stakeholders with this statement, and I'm just going to read it. It says, the importance of stakeholders in the budget process cannot be overstated. Regular and frequent reporting is necessary to provide accountability, educate and inform stakeholders, and improve their confidence in your organization. Communication and involvement is an essential component of the budget process. Now I see another comment, so let me pull up the chat. D asks the question, how to properly document and allocate in-kind budgets, how to show in-kind support being spent on the budget sheet. Okay, D, this is, I will not be talking specifically about budget presentation, but I will definitely, at the end, D, we can talk about how do you recognize in-kind support. So often, it depends on the actual grant application. Some grants specify in-kind cannot be counted. Others expect it to be accounted and allow you to recognize it. So it is really, in terms of the grant application, it really is dependent on the grant application. When it is on your financial statement, there is absolutely a way to recognize in kind, and it's important to recognize that, even if grant applications may not count it, because it absolutely is helpful for you. So yes, we can talk about that towards the end if I don't fully address that. So great, thank you very much, Dee, for that question. Okay, so now, given the importance of stakeholders, I do want to take some time and brainstorm with everybody in the class, in the seminar, who are your organization's stakeholders. I'm going to change my share screen to a whiteboard, so it'll just take me a second to do that. And I'm going to ask you to type into the chat who your stakeholders are, examples of your stakeholders. And I'm going to ask Michelle to read them to me. And I'm going to put them on the list here. So thinking about who cares about your organization, thinking about your organization's stakeholders, who are they? Because I'd like to come up with a list before we move forward. Okay, so go, feel free to type them in to the chat. And if you have a question about them, what I'm asking, just let me know as well.
Okay, so we have the school districts, faculty, students.
School districts, faculty, students, good.
Public
I'm sorry?
school, each of the individual public schools and businesses.
Okay, terrific.
Christine said members.
Well, let me, individual schools and businesses, okay. Yep. Now, and the next one was?
Members. So
members.
Probably organization
members. Okay, I'm going to put that down. And if that's not correct, just let me know. Okay, terrific. Any other?
What do we have? We have state agencies.
Great.
We have employees.
Employees of the organization?
Probably, yes, I would go ahead and say of the organization, yep.
Okay, and again, if I'm not catching it correctly, just let us know in the chat and we'll correct it.
Other community organizations.
Ah, terrific.
Or NPOs who share our mission is another. It's great. Volunteers.
Terrific. Volunteers. Okay. Any other stakeholders that you can think of?
So organization that's serving individuals with disabilities, they have the people who are caring for and engaging with their clients. the family members.
So caregivers, is that a fair way to say caregivers and family members?
Sure.
Okay. Was there something else, Michelle, in that one?
No, you had family members. The other things have been mentioned. We had
Oh, okay. Terrific.
and I'm trying to kind of ferret them
Absolutely.
out as we
Absolutely. Thank you.
So let's see. There's another one. Grantors.
Okay, wonderful. Yep.
Board members.
Board members. I was wondering about that. Yes. Terrific. Any other ones?
We have membership and individual donors and sponsors.
Okay, individual donors and sponsors. Terrific.
Okay, I think it's slowed down.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, everybody, for your contribution. Yeah. Now, if you look at this list, you can see that stakeholders are coming from a variety of perspectives. Grantors, donors, sponsors. They are interested, they are wanting to make sure that what they contribute, volunteers contribute their time, donors contribute money, of what they're contributing actually is going to have impact. You have the individuals you're serving, the family members, caregivers, schools, students. They're interested in making sure that your services meet their needs, right? Organization members, agencies, state agencies. I might put, if you don't mind, and federal agencies. If any of you work in programs that are impacted by federal regulations or are part of, get support from a federal program, making sure you understand where they're coming from, where the state is coming from, where other community organizations, all of these have their own perspective. And I think what often happens in the budget process is that these voices are not necessarily heard in an organized way or at the right time of when it's valuable. There is a type of budgeting called participatory budgeting, which is where cities and local governments will make budget decisions and allocations. And then they will say, okay, this amount is going to be for the community. And then they let the community decide whether it'll be a park or whatever. But my concern with that is that the decision has already been made about how much is going to go to that community. Maybe they haven't heard from those communities. Maybe they haven't heard from you as nonprofit organizations who work in those communities. And suddenly you're given, oh yes, now you can help us decide how the funds are going to be spent, but big decisions have already been made. And so what I'm thinking, what I'm proposing is that even at the organizational level, considering ways of bringing in stakeholder input is valuable. Okay, now I'm going to stop sharing this, and I'm going to, it'll just take me a second and go back to my PowerPoint. Okay, so now I hope I've given you some things to begin to think about. And oh, I'm sorry, I do want to talk about, I pulled out some examples from grantors. Now, I just pulled out one from Charles County and one from Frederick County. I will say that these criteria for these grants is very similar to many other grant applications or grant requirements. but I'm just going to point out some of the things that are required. This is the Charles County Charitable Trust grant criteria. They say that the goals, objectives, and outcomes should be clearly defined and achievable. That there should be a clear definition, identification of the potential impact on the quality of lives for underserved populations and for all residents of Charles County. That there is clear recognition or of the extent to which partnerships are formed with other organizations to better target services, to improve programs, and potentially even reduce costs. And then finally, looking at how diverse your funding sources are. Are you relying on one or two key donors, or do you get funding from a variety? So, so those are some of the excerpts from Charles County's Charitable Trust criteria. Now, Delaplane Foundation, words are slightly different. It's obviously much shorter, but it says highest priority will be given to those organizations most able to demonstrate the ability to provide programs and services with long-term benefits, the impact, measurable results, and the ability to attract financial support from other additional sources. These, as I said, are very similar to what many grantors require. Another one that I have seen is the requirement that your goals for your grant application for the programs that you're requesting grant funding for are clearly tied to that grantor's or the city or the county strategic plan. They will oftentimes give you their goals, and they want to see how your grant application is going to further their strategic plan and their goals. So these are just examples of areas where organizations have to be clear. And I believe a strategic budget process can help with that. So what I would like for you to do now is think about your own organization's current budget process. And hopefully you have just pencil and paper available. And I have some questions here. And I want you to just sort of jot down some notes about your current budget process, your organization's current budget process. Do you know what it is? Are you familiar with it? Does it have the characteristics of an effective budget process? Is it strategic, multi-year, allows for a variety of perspectives? All of those things that we talked about. Does your organization's budget process allow for good communication, input from relevant stakeholders, transparent decision-making? Is the budget based on and does it clearly support your organization's goals and strategic plan? And can it be used, your budget that you develop, can it be used to develop grant proposals that meet the criteria of the grantors in a streamlined way so that you're not having to do rework, you're not having to sort of create a new budget in order to meet your grantors? So I'm just going to give you a few minutes to just think about, write it down. We're going to use these notes later on in the group exercise. So just jot down some notes. And like I said, I will give you just a few minutes. So let me see if I can. So I'm going to mute myself and then I'll come back in about 3 or 4 minutes.
Janet, Michael is saying in the chat, and this is a great point, he's just asking, can this budget process be effective for small nonprofit organizations that have less than $50,000 each year?
I absolutely think so. Yes. Yes. Okay, I hope that gave you enough time. And you may have heard the question that Michael asked about whether this budget process would work for small organizations. And I believe it does. And the reason I believe that is because it's very adaptable. It's not that you have to do every single one of these steps, but there may be the stakeholder the identification of stakeholders and figuring out how to involve them in the process. One of those, something like that might make absolute sense. Absolutely, I think that if any organization can streamline their budget process, streamline their strategic planning process, streamline their grant application process, that's of benefit. So I hope so. And Michael, I would be really interested at the end to hear from you about where you think it might or might not work for your organization particularly. All right, so keeping that in mind. Okay, so hopefully you had some time on that. Now that you sort of come up, sort of described your own organization's budget process, I want you to think about, what are your grantors, your current grantors and donors looking for? Do they want to know how and when you're spending their money, what the impact of it is? Can your organization ensure that the funding that you receive is spent only for purposes it was provided for? Oftentimes grants are for a very specific program, for a very specific purpose. Does your budget process allow for that? And then can you track the impact and allocations of each of the different sources of funding and anything else that your grantors or donors are looking for? So if you could take just a few minutes and on that same sheet of paper, just jot down what you're familiar with in terms of your donors, your grantors. What are they looking for from your organization? And again, I'll just give you a few minutes. I'm going to mute my microphone again. Okay, I hope that gave you enough time to jot down some thoughts. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and take our first 10-minute break. And so what I'd like to do, let's see, Michelle, what time do you have on your side?
11:48.
11:48. So what about if we say noon? Does that work?
Terrific.
Okay, so if everyone could come back at noon, that would be terrific. So I'll see you in about 10 minutes. Welcome back. And let's see here. I'm going to just, I need to just make one little adjustment here so I can see my screen. Okay. Now I'm going to actually have you all go into small groups. And let me switch over to the next PowerPoint slide. I want to give you an opportunity to obviously meet and talk with some of the other participants in the seminar. And I'm going to ask you to talk about this question. What are the key gaps in your organization's budget process that are preventing you from successfully applying for grants, meeting the grantor's impact and reporting requirements, and achieving your organization's goals? So I hope that the two sort of individual exercises we did before break started you thinking about this question. And so I want to give you an opportunity. We'll give you about 15 minutes in small groups. Michelle is going to do that. And what I will ask you to do is to also, once you've had a chance to discuss it, maybe identify if there's 2 or 3 gaps that are sort of consistent across your organizations, or maybe not consistent, but you feel very strongly that these are potential gaps, to identify the top 3, and then also agree among your group who is willing to be a spokesperson for your group, because then we're going to come back into the larger group, and I'm going to give each group a chance to share with us your gaps, and then also have a little bit of a debrief discussion in the larger group. So this is the question I'm asking you to think about. What are the key gaps in your organization's budget process that's preventing your organization from successfully applying for grants, meeting grantor requirements, and achieving your organization goals? Okay, now Michelle, I'm going to let you sort of take over here to facilitate the putting everyone in breakout groups.
Sure.
And then, thank you.
All right, I'm sending everybody now.
Okay, welcome back. I am going to stop sharing my screen so that I can put everyone on gallery, and I can hopefully see you. And I want to open this up now. And what I'd like is for the spokesperson for group number 1, if you wouldn't mind unmuting and maybe even turning on your video if you're comfortable with that, and sharing, just giving us a summary of what your group talked about and what your sort of issues that you identified. Michael, are you the volunteer spokesperson for group 1?
I was in group 3.
Oh, group 3, okay. Let's see. Who was in group, who's the spokesperson for group 1, or anybody in group 1 that would be able to talk about your discussion?
It's Rosanna. We forgot to identify somebody.
Oh, that's okay. That's no problem. Thank you for volunteering.
Well, no, actually, I was going to pitch it to Tora because I thought what she said was so great at the end.
Okay. Okay, let's see. Tora, would you mind unmuting your mic and sharing with us what your group talked about?
Oh my, I wasn't ready for this.
Hi, Tora. Nice to see you.
Well, for the most part, I guess what was discussed, some impediments in terms of one has identified, their budget being so small, whereas a funder would not fund the program because the budget is too small. And how do you overcome that? And another identified, really identifying the qualitative piece of a program versus always reporting quantitative reporting. And the way the funder is requesting to their reporting format does not really allow to identify that qualitative piece. And I just provided suggestions in terms of if there's, not really knowing that funder and, and what their reporting process is. I just provided what I do in terms of providing not only the quantitative, but the qualitative piece of the programs that the grants that I oversee and so forth. And so
Tora, may I ask you a question? So do you find when you're talking about qualitative impact, is that more of a narrative as opposed to numbers? Is that what I just want to make sure I understand the differentiation of the quantitative versus the qualitative
well
impact.
And I do understand there's a fine line.
Yeah, absolutely.
There is a fine line. But what because sometimes the numbers, I get it, may say something a little different. But what I focus on, although the numbers may say something a little different, what I focus on is the effort. What have we done? And because one thing that part of my reporting is related to students. And, you know, we cannot force students to do anything, but what we can do is, you know, provide the coaching piece. What are our efforts to ensure that a student is successful? And so to me, that's more qualitative, you know,
Yeah.
looking at
Okay.
the qualitative piece. And so, and then some things, you know, there may be a greater need in another area. You identify a need during that, looking at the numbers and so forth, and that may have to be addressed next fiscal year because now we're at the end of. But you know, that's for the most part what I focus on. What are
Okay.
our efforts? What resources are we using, and to ensure that we are successful. When I say we, all stakeholders, you know, whether if it's students, faculty, whatever. So that's what I try to
Okay.
focus on.
Okay, and then my final question for you is, do you find that your organization's budget process helps you in terms of reporting?
Well, because I manage the budget, I create the budget. So, I mean, I handled the whole entire process. I mean, approved by, you know, hierarchy, of course. So I haven't really ran into any impediments as it relates
Okay.
or gaps as it relates to that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Anyone else in group one that wanted to add to what Tora talked about? Was there anything else that you discussed that that you would like to mention? Okay, thank you so much, Tora, and I really appreciate your willingness to jump right in there. Okay, group two. Did group two identify a spokesperson, or is someone willing to provide a little debrief of what your group identified?
Yes, my name is Terry Branch. I'm
Hi,
from
Terry.
the Southern Maryland area. And the group kind of sort of designated me to be the spokesperson. And we had 5 participants in the group. And mostly the group is here to learn about grants. They are not dealing directly with grants. And that was pretty much the consensus of the group. And they wanted to be familiar. They're not familiar with the grants. They wanted, we actually shared knowledge of how to get assistance for doing grants and things of that nature through the American Small Business DC, SBDC office, which is a subsidiary of the SBA office. One organization that I'm personally involved in, I think we are doing what you're asking as far as tracking our grants, associating the expenditures of the grants, pretty good on our budget level because it's a camp. We run a camp and we get state money for that. And also we had the PPI loan, which saved us through COVID, and came out of the Small Business Administration office, and they're actually turning that into a grant. So our first loan was converted from loan to grant, and we had to track that as well. And that was easily accountable because it was for labor only. So it made it really easy. We paid salaries to keep the couple employees that we have afloat. And that was pretty much our consensus. Everybody's here to learn more about grants.
Okay, Michelle, yes, did you want to say anything?
Yes, I just wanted to add to a couple of things that Terry was saying, just so that everyone on the call knows, we work alongside SBDC, and we provide support for the nonprofit entities. So when Terry was talking about, she's talking about the Paycheck Protection Program grants that were out there. So we helped a number of the nonprofits who were applying for that particular program. And then, yes, with loan forgiveness, those are turned into a grant, and the SBA then is saying, you do not need to repay what had originally gone out as a loan through the Paycheck Protection Program. they converted them to grants. And for, you know, the nonprofit community, that's pretty universal. So I just want to make sure I mention that, because oftentimes SBDC will send nonprofits who have come to them with regard to these things to the Nonprofit Institute, because that's what we're here for. So if you're looking for particular grants or wondering if you may qualify for different things, please reach out to us, because that's what we're here for.
Okay, and yes, and I hope that everyone's understood, and I'll just clarify too, that the purpose of this seminar is basically the preparation to prepare you for grant applications, making sure your budget process, all of these things are in line. So while I'm not going to be speaking directly about grant applications and going about that process, I think Michelle and the Nonprofit Institute can really provide you with that assistance, even on a one-on-one basis, if necessary. But what I hope you'll come away with today is sort of some of the work that can be done in preparation for those. Okay, all right, so thank you so much, Terry. I appreciate your debrief and summary. Let's see, Michael, go right ahead.
Well, it was just Robin, Dee, and myself in the group, well, connecting with one another. And I think each of us came up with, Dee has said her organization that she's, it's important to keep up with in-kind donations, in-kind time, and document that. And Robin said that her organization was just getting started. It's a young organization. The organization that I'm president of, and just so happened Terry is the vice president, it's a 25-year-old organization, very small. One of the main things in our organization for the past 18 years, other than that, we have put on this program called Juneteenth in St. Mary's County. And we do have sponsors, but the grant, we get a grant from the county every year for each year. And the St. Mary's County Arts Council have also been instrumental in supporting us. But most of our, less than $50,000 our organization have been operating on. And we do have small things. We do oral histories, and the Southern Maryland Heritage organization have given us funds to do oral histories. But this budget process that you're talking about, unless we grow, nobody is salary, everybody's volunteering. This is a good basis if we really start to grow and do other things, but it would be hard to really do a long, we know what we're going to do every year. You were saying that the budgeting should be multi-year. We know what we're going to do every year. We've been pretty consistent to be able to put on this important program in St. Mary's County. But I think it's good to hear what you're saying, because we hope to one day really grow, that we can really be using these processes that you're talking about to really grow. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, Michael. Yeah, and I'm definitely interested in, from everybody in the seminar, at the end, after I've gone through some of the tools, maybe there's one tool, Michael, that would be really useful for you to use. It may not be the whole budget process, or just even being aware of this sort of opportunity and method of, if you do decide to grow significantly, figuring out what is that going to require. And it might actually end up being something that will take, 3 or 4 years. So then suddenly a multi-year budget process becomes very relevant, because you can't go from, 0 to 60 overnight. And so thinking about that step by step, reaching out to your stakeholders, maybe finding out what are they interested in seeing you do? How do you expand from the Juneteenth and the oral histories? Is there a way to use them? All of these sort of questions could come up that would then help your organization, not just say, we want to grow, but say, oh, it's in these specific areas. So I hope that even if these tools are not useful immediately, there's something you'll keep in your back pocket and say, oh, wait a minute, we're ready to think about this. For some of the other comments that were shared, my dance company was not a large budget at all. It was I understand, a volunteer-based organization, and trying to keep it going and sustainable. So I hope that that I can explain this process in a way that is relevant to all types of organizations, whether you're preparing to do grant applications, whether you're thinking about growing. And I know that Roseanne had mentioned one of her questions that she was hoping that we would talk about is this idea of what happens if suddenly one of your large donors, because of COVID or something else, suddenly drops out. How do you adjust? And how do you figure that out? And I hope that some of these tools will help on that. So thank you, everybody, for sharing. Now, I'm going to go back to my share screen. So I just have to find it. I'm sorry. There it is. And I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint. And I think that much of what you were talking about, I think is a good lead in to this next section. And now I'm going to talk about what am I talking about when I'm saying strategic budget process? What does that mean? And I just want to remind you that I'm not at all advocating for you to throw out your current budget process and start over. Basically, what I hope to give you are some ideas, some tools that you can pick and choose from that's appropriate for your organization, that helps to strengthen your organization's funding and sustainability. So these phases and the tools I'll be talking about also probably are not necessary if your budget is very stable. Maybe, as Michael was saying, you have a stable existing program that's clearly delivering on meeting their goals, fulfilling a need. This is not the tool that you would use. But if you find if your organization finds itself in a situation where there is a new, undefined, or complex issue that you need to address, that you want to address, this process, it can be very helpful to give you a framework, because it can get overwhelming, especially when you have, I think Tora was mentioning all these different stakeholders, schools, students, all of these. How do you organize that? That can be overwhelming. So if it's as I said, new or complex challenge that requires the input and consideration of a range of stakeholders or experts, maybe you have individuals who have done research or want to have some input into your program, or the modification of an existing program. Maybe you have a program that is not achieving the goals or is not having the impact that your organization is hoping for, and you need to sort of regroup and figure out, okay, what is it that we need to do? or when circumstances change for your organization. Maybe a program or your organization is experiencing significant growth, or significant funding shortages, or staffing or volunteer shortages, or the organization realizes that they are not meeting their strategic goals. Those are the situations where this can be extremely helpful. So oftentimes, especially when I was working on with federal agencies, and we'd see a program that wasn't having the impact we wanted, we would talk to them about it, and the first answer was always, we need more money, we need more resources. And that is not always possible. And sometimes that isn't even the reason that the program isn't having the impact that we would want. Sometimes it's that the agency or the organization is addressing a different problem, that they're not working on the right one, or that the programs that they have selected or developed to address it are not actually addressing that problem. So this process tries to do a deep dive into those types of questions. So as you see here on this chart, I'm going to start in the blue quadrant to strategic planning. And I'll do a deep dive into each of these phases in just a minute. But basically, you have the strategic planning process where you explore your organization's vision, you identify the challenges that you're wanting to address. What is it that your organization wants to try to improve? Then, based on that strategic plan, you identify the programs, the approaches to achieving those goals. You develop them. Now, once you have developed the program, then you develop a budget consistent with those approaches, with your priorities. The budget reflects those priorities. And then finally, once you receive the funding, you implement the programs and evaluate them. Now, it is an iterative process. Ideally, the information from this year's program and experience and evaluation feeds into next year's budget process, feeds into the strategic plan, reviewing it to see if there needs to be any changes, reviewing the programs to see if there needs to be any changes. How does that impact the funding that you need? Where are the sources of funding going to come from? So it's iterative, and it goes from 1 year into the next. Now, I'd like to go through, let's see here, each of the phases and just talk a little bit about them. We have, as I said, the first phase, which is the strategic planning phase, that establishes the broad goals to guide your agency's or your organization's decision making. The first step in that is assess the situation. Carefully examine the situation your organization is faced with. Gather data. Determine and evaluate what the steps are that you're going to take to address the situation. And I should underline this next part. Fight the urge to solve a problem before you know what it is. Make sure that you've taken the time to figure out what is the problem. When we talk about gathering data, that can include talking to your communities that you're serving, identifying their priorities, identifying your organization's priorities, talking to your stakeholders, your grantors, the agencies that might be the state and local agencies that might be relevant, your clients, those who receive your services, gathering the information from all of them, identifying areas that will pose a challenge or barrier, as well as areas that have an opportunity. Based on that data, actually formulate, identify the challenge. And that can include whether it's a challenge related to services, maybe it's capital investment for your organization, or even it could be internal operational or management challenges within your organization. So trying to clearly identify and formulate the challenge. From that, you then develop your vision and your goals, which basically whatever format your strategic plan would want to take. And then disseminate that, distribute that to your stakeholders, to your volunteers, make it available to the general public, however it's relevant. So once you have this sort of broad goal laid out, this is then going to create the framework for the next steps. Next, working on identifying ideas, whether it's programs, projects, to achieve those goals, to address those challenges. Making sure first that your agency has financial policies, program operating policies, so that those in your organization clearly understand how your organization operates. But aside from the policies, once you have that framework, then working on generating ideas, developing the program plans. How are we going to meet the goals? How are we going to address challenges or take advantage of opportunities? Generating quite a few ideas at this point. And this is a good place to include stakeholder input. And I'll talk about that when I talk about the tool. Once you have a wide range of ideas, clearly, we all know, organizations can't pursue all of those. So organizing them, figuring out which ones are most critical, which ones do we need to deal with now, which ones could we evolve into later on. Organizing the ideas, making sure that you develop these ideas, these programs, projects, services, consistent with the policies and your strategic plan. Then actually developing strategies for implementing them. How are you going to develop this program? Do you have to hire staff? Do you have to increase volunteers? Do you have to get more funding? Figuring out the strategy for trying to implement the idea. Now, once you have identified your priority ideas for achieving your goals, then it comes developing the budget. And the budget should support the goals and the approaches that you have identified. Your organization should have a budget preparation and adoption process, whether it goes to the board, who is involved in the budget development, all of that should be sort of clearly laid out. Now, before you can actually figure out what you need, you actually need to figure out an action plan. And when I talk about action plan, I mean an action plan with actual dates on it, saying, okay, we're going to do these steps by these dates. And that is to implement those strategies that you developed. Once you have your action plan and you know sort of when you need resources, you can then develop and then evaluate how you're going to fund them. This is where identifying those organizations, those federal agencies, state and local agencies that can support you or that can be barriers to you is critical. It helps you to identify who should you apply, what grants should you apply for? And you start to look at those options at this time while you're developing the budget. Again, you want to consider your stakeholders as part of your assisters, ideally. Then once you've identified the options, we can apply for these grants, or we have this much in general donation money that we have a lot of flexibility to use, or we have membership fees, whatever it might be, all of those options, and you have the plan, then you develop the budget and you figure out when you need funds to implement that action plan and where those funds are going to come from. Now, oftentimes, the ideas, the plan is larger than the funds. So the final step in this phase is that the decision makers, whether it's your board or executive director, whoever has this responsibility, has to make the choices necessary to adopt a budget, ideally preparing, again, a multi-year budget. Okay, now once you have done this and you've received the funding, you can then implement your program and then evaluate performance and make adjustments. Monitoring, measuring, evaluating your performance, including stakeholder feedback, and then making adjustments as necessary. Okay, so that are the phases. Now, and then the next section that I'm going to talk about are the actual tools. Let me see, I think I have a question. I'm sorry. Let me check. Okay, great. Okay, good. Thank you. All right, so there are very useful tools that are helpful in each of these phases. And I've tried to organize the tools on this chart, summarize the tools by each of these phases. And I'm going to go through them. Like I said, we have been playing a little bit with a gap analysis and we will in the exercise. We have done a bit of a brainstorming when we were thinking about stakeholders, but some of these other ones may be less familiar to you. So I'm going to go through them. If you have questions about them, let me know. But the first one I want to just go through is gap analysis. This is a tool that's very helpful in figuring out what challenges, what direction your organization should go. Maybe it is in a very specific part of your organization. As I said, it could be for a new program. It could be because maybe you've your funding has significantly changed. So first is describing your current state of the challenge your organization is facing. And that is really what I asked you to do first this morning, was look at, in your first group, where are the gaps between, I had you describe where your current budget process is, and then I had you describe what your grantors are expecting. Sort of in my example, that would be the ideal state. But in your situation, it might be helping, 12-year-old students graduate from middle school, whatever it might be, I don't know. But you would be describing the ideal state. So first you describe your current state and then your ideal state. And then you'd identify the gaps between the two. Now, I have done some studying in what we call creative thinking or creative problem solving, and it is very helpful for all of us if statements, when we're trying to address problems, are framed in the way of a question. So you want to begin each of the gaps with not, for example, we don't have enough money. That sort of is a statement. It sort of like shuts my brain down. I can't think past that. But I could word it as, how could we identify additional funding? That's the gap. It still recognizes that you don't have enough money, but it's not saying just simply, we don't have enough money. Or maybe it's access to schools. Maybe it's, with COVID and all of that, there are so many challenges that everyone is facing in achieving their ideal state. So trying to word the gap as a question, beginning how to, or how do we reach out and make contact with students virtually, how, even though they may not be in classrooms. I'm just making some examples up. So once you have, and ideally, the gap analysis is done with a group that reflects multiple perspectives of the work your organization does. So if it should ideally would include some stakeholders or clients or volunteers or employees of your organization. So it would, in the group that would work on that gap analysis would not simply be maybe 2 or 3 employees within your organization. Ideally, it would include representatives from your different stakeholder groups. Now, once you have done the gap analysis, you've identified all of these gaps. And the group would then ideally identify the key gaps, like I asked you to do, the 1 or 2 key gaps that are really preventing you from addressing the challenge. And then going to a brainstorming where you would answer the question, what might be all the things we can do to increase our funding? Now, when you do brainstorming for this, you want to begin each idea with a verb because we're asking the question, what can we do? You want these to be action ideas. Research grant options, identify untapped donors, I don't know. So, but starting off with a verb. You write it down on a Post-it note, and in the group, you say it out loud and then put it on the board. This is not the time to, as people are coming up with ideas, to say, oh, wait a minute, no, can't do that. This is not the time to judge or evaluate. We'll do that later. This is just trying to come up with ideas. This is the time to dream, come up with those wild ideas. The goal is to try to come up with at least 20, 25 ideas. So once you have these ideas, the next tool is called highlighting. And this group that did the brainstorming, you look at all the Post-its that are on the board, and each individual just goes up and marks with a dot or a check the 3 ideas or the 3 to 5 ideas they think are most promising or most compelling, most innovative, or on target. There's no need to justify, defend why each person thinks those are their top 3 or 5. They just put them up there. Now, ideally, you then have a board with these Post-its, and there will be several ideas that clearly have the most support. And you would take those, it's probably not down to just 1, but it would be maybe 3 or 4 ideas out of that 20 or 25 that you started with. And you then evaluate them. This tool, the evaluation matrix, I think is the sort of one of the key pieces of being able to effectively translate ideas and goals into actions and then ultimately into funds. And the way you do this is you create a chart and you list each of the ideas in the first column. And then the group identifies criteria that they want to evaluate each idea on by asking, what does this action or idea have to be for us to want to do it? And so you might start the question, will this idea get us more money? That's simple. Or does this idea increase our outreach to students who are 12 years old? Or is this idea, is this idea a practical extension of what we're already doing? Will this increase our impact? So you come up with about 3 criteria. And you list and you write them up at the top of each of these columns. And ideally, the more specific your criteria are to your organization, the more helpful. So if you have performance measures, if you want to try to reach 50% of the 12-year-olds, or you want to try to get $10,000 in funding, you could add those specifics in there, and those would make it more helpful. Now, once you've come up with the criteria, you then are going to rate each of the ideas. Now, this is not a numeric exercise. This is, so you don't want to use numbers 1 through 5 or 1 through 6. Better to use letters, such as what I have here, A through F, or you could do A through D, whatever makes sense to your organization. And then, as a group, you fill out this chart column by column. What you don't want to do is take idea 1, give it a rating for criteria 1, and then go to criteria 2, and then go to criteria 3. The goal here is to actually compare the ideas within the one criteria. So for example, the criteria, will this idea get us an additional $10,000? You would go through each of idea 1, 2, and 3 and give it a rating. Then you would go to criteria 2, go down the column, give them a rating, and then go to criteria 3 and give each of the ideas a rating. So that at the end, you have a chart with relative values for each of the ideas based on the criteria. This will provide then, hopefully, the foundation for a good discussion within your organization about the relative strengths and weaknesses of each of these approaches. And you factor these ratings into your final decision about which of these programs you might end up deciding to pursue. But it is not, what it's trying to do is recognize that deciding what approach to take can be difficult. And if it's a complex, multi-pronged issue, you need to have this richness of discussion. But it also allows you to prioritize, because that ultimately is what you have to do. Now, once you have your evaluation matrix, you've learned a lot, hopefully, from that discussion, and you use what we call a feedback grid. And you write down all of the strong pluses to that idea. Any concerns you might have, again, phrasing those as questions. Things that, oh, have we really thought about this issue? There may be areas after doing the evaluation grid that you realize, whoops, we're actually not ready to implement this program. We actually need to do some more research, or we need additional information. So you have a questions box there. And then maybe there's ahas coming out. Maybe there's new ideas from all of that discussion about these ideas. Wait a minute. Here's some ideas that we didn't even think about, and at least noting them so that you have them for the future. Then once you have your feedback grid, I've mentioned this tool, and it's a very simple tool. Listing any individual, organizations, grantors, government entities, policies, regulations, laws that support and can assist you to implement your new program. And then you do the same and identify those that could hinder or block the implementation of that program. The evaluation matrix and the feedback grid and the assisters and resistors are information that you then use to help you develop your action plan. And I recommend, doesn't have to be, but my recommendation is that you do your immediate for the current year. you look out to the next fiscal year, and then maybe even longer term if this program has multiple pieces, or if it turns out that you can't actually implement the program this year, but there are steps you have to take and you need money for those steps early on. And so, I think that the idea of having these different timeframes can be helpful. You then specify dates that you want to accomplish these by. Now, you may change them, but it's important to at least put a framework of timeline down. Who is going to do it? Is it your organization? Is it your employees, your volunteers, your board? Maybe it's a grantor. Maybe it's a local agency. How much resources, what resources do you need to do to accomplish that step? And do you have the resources to accomplish that? Now, the next phase of this is adding in the specifics of the budget. As you see it, I have the total resources required, the resources that you have available or anticipate having, what you need in addition, and then thinking about where you're going to get those funds. Donors, memberships, grant, and putting them in the right time frame. Oftentimes, grants can take a year. You at a minimum have to plan for applying for a grant this fiscal year in order to get the funds for next fiscal year. So trying to lay it out in this way, I think helps you to build a more realistic budget based on the plan, based on the information you got from doing each of these different tools. Okay, now let me see how we're doing. Okay, I'm going to stop for a moment and ask if there's any questions about these tools. You're going to have an opportunity, we'll have an opportunity to discuss them more fully later on. But I did want to just stop for a second. Okay, if not, I'd like to go ahead and take our next 10-minute break. So, Michelle?
Yes.
Are you able to, let's see, is it about 5 after?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so how about if we come back at 15 after? Does that work?
That works.
Okay, and I'll ask you to keep the time for that. Thank you.
Will do.
So I'll see you in 10 minutes. Okay, welcome back. And we're now going to, I'm going to have you go into small breakout groups again. This time we're going to give you about 10 minutes to talk in your group, to reflect on our discussion earlier about gaps in the budget process or issues that you might be having, and talk about what one thing you would each do to try to strengthen the connection between your organization's budget process, your organization operations, strategic planning, and the grant application process. I hope that there was something in the tools or the phases that I sort of introduced to you, and just talk about if there's one thing you could do to take back to your organization and share with them, what would it be? All right, so I'm gonna ask Michelle again to put everyone into groups. Again, if you could identify a spokesperson to come back and to just give a debrief like the 3 that did before about what your discussion was. We'll do that when you get back from the breakout group. So, Michelle?
Okay, here we go. Okay, Janet, looks like we have everybody back.
Great. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment, and I'm going to open it up. Okay, so I'm going to ask the spokesperson for group 1 to go ahead and turn on your audio, video, and share with us what you discussed. If you can summarize it, that would be terrific.
Well, this is Rosanna again, but I'm not allowed to push it off on someone else this time.
Okay, well, thank you, Roseanne, for volunteering.
Yeah, well, all we were able to talk about in our group was increasing the volunteer base, and we didn't really have we had just started talking about what kinds of ideas the person could come up with. And that was, they would need a little bit of money because a little bit of money is required for like an AmeriCorps or Senior Corps volunteer, but then the state pays the rest of it, and they could, they're actually not volunteers. They get paid a stipend, and they also sometimes get some benefit like health insurance, that sort of thing. But it does cost a little bit that you have to pay toward that person's yearly, yearly salary. But it's not much. It's like between $1,500 and $2,500. So anyway.
Okay. So Roseanne, that was something that all of the organizations that were represented in your group felt would be a good first step to try to go back with. Is that correct?
Well, we just had started discussing it, so we got pulled out.
Okay.
Before we had an opportunity to do much more than that.
Okay,
we weren't real sure that we were answering the question either. So I feel like if you and your group felt like it was a productive discussion, that's what's important really in this. And actually, Rosanna, you bring up a good point, that when I have had more time, I've actually had the groups go through actual scenarios. And that's where, as you said, you were just starting to get into it in those next steps. But we have to be time conscious here. So thank you very much, Rosanna. I did want to ask, I think, Robin, you might have had a question. And I wanted to make sure before I move on, that if you have a question, please share it with us, and I'm happy to respond. So you can put it in the chat if you'd like, or unmute your mic and share your question with us.
Hello. No, we were just trying to get more clarity in group 3, just in reference to the question that was being asked.
Okay.
So that's what it was.
Okay. Thank you very much, Robin. And I'm sorry if I wasn't clear about the question, but we'll talk about it further after each group has done their debrief. Okay, so group 2, who is the spokesperson for group 2 this time?
That would be me.
Hi, Camden. How are you today?
I am good. How are you?
Good, thanks.
So in our group, we talked a bit about, I had Emily and Tora in my group.
Great.
And we talked about how the budget and stuff would have to be changing with the COVID protocols being changed constantly, and figuring out the adjustments that would be from going from virtual to in-person, and seeing about like transportation and more factors that would go into being in person.
Okay, yeah, and Camden, was that true for all 3 organizations, that you're faced with this constant sort of change in protocols and demands on your programs?
So I'm actually a recent college graduate, so I don't necessarily have an organization, but with Tora and Emily, it seemed fairly consistent with both of their organizations, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Okay, terrific. Thank you, Camden. Appreciate that.
No problem.
Okay, yeah, group 3.
who would like to debrief us on your discussion? Let's see, I'm not sure who was in group 3. I know Robin was. Hi, Robin.
Hi. There really wasn't much of a discussion, so just sharing some brief information as to the organizations we were involved in, but we didn't really get in depth as to the question itself. So that's pretty much it.
Okay, thank you, Robin, for giving me an update. Appreciate that. Okay, I am going to switch over now to the PowerPoint, and I will I'm sorry if I was not as clear as maybe it would have been helpful to your groups, but I hope that at a minimum for group 3, I'm glad you had a chance to share with each other. And really, that's part of this whole seminar, right? This opportunity to share with other organizations that are dealing with similar situations about what you're doing. It's the opportunity to connect. What I was asking for is having you talk about what can your organization do to help you better, to improve, strengthen your strategic plans and your grant applications. And I think group 1 sort of jumped to the solutions, which is fine. They went to, we need to figure out ways to get more volunteers. So maybe each of those organizations are facing staffing shortages, maybe the workload has increased for whatever reason. And if we'd had the opportunity to do some of the idea tools, you would have been able to then develop those ideas of how to get volunteers. What would it cost? How much money would you get as for stipends? All of those things we could have ironed out. For group 2, I think that one is actually an excellent, the idea that even during the current fiscal year, what you need to do may change because of COVID protocols. This is totally out of your organization's control. You have to follow the rules that are provided in person, virtual, whatever it might be, and the costs and the demands on your organizations. And I think that's an excellent example of one where when an organization now is developing their budget, they would factor that in. Do we need to have some type of extra flexibility in our implementation of our programs? And what does that mean for our budget? And do we need to factor that in? So I think group 2's, this question of the COVID protocols and the changes is a great example of how you could use some of these tools to help you. And I think group 1's example of volunteers is also a great example. So what I want to try to do now is sort of bring it full circle. How does this strategic budgeting process, these tools, how can they help you, your organization, improve your grant proposals, your preparation for developing grant proposals, and your accountability? I believe that this process can help you develop realistic and accurate grant proposals, that because it comes out of all of this work that your organization has done leading up to it, through all the way from strategic planning to developing the budgets to figuring out when you need money, when and for what, just helps you be more specific, more clear in your budget proposals. It streamlines the process. You don't have to, I think this is Michelle's word, retrofit a grant proposal into your existing budget. Instead, it comes up organically by having you thought about these things and having considered where you're going to get the funding and when you need it. It streamlines that process. It really, I think, significantly improves your understanding of what your clients need, because you have ideally involved them in some of the initial phases. You accurately identify the problems you're trying to address. That brings you clarity. Because the worst thing, and I have seen this happen, an organization goes after and spends money and pursues one track and realizes halfway down, wait a minute, that's not actually delivering what our clients want. And they have to come back and regroup. This tries to minimize, eliminate that risk. It helps you to accurately identify what resources your organization needs and when they need them. Do you need them this year, next year? Or is it a long-term issue that you can really look at long-term? And looking at grant cycles, which ones match up with our resource needs? How do we align grant funding with when we need the funds? Obviously, directly links your strategic plan and what you want to achieve with your budget. It simplifies your ability to monitor. If you've laid out what you're going to achieve when, you can then go back and check on that. You've already laid out the goals of when you want to achieve things. And ideally, and I totally understand, I believe it was Tora, who talked about the difficulty of qualitative impact. But it's important, and it's important to figure out ways of trying to track that. And if you have that as part of your action plan, maybe, as she said, what services we're delivering when, that can help develop, make richer the qualitative measures. And then finally, by clearly identifying what your organization can deliver, when you can deliver them, you can build grant proposals that accurately reflect your organization's capacity and potential impact. So I hope that these tools, like I said, maybe you take one or two of them, or at least this idea of connecting them will help you to then develop and improve your grant proposals and donor accountability. Now, I would like to open it up for Q&A and discussion, so I'm going to stop sharing. But I also want to go back and let's see, great, I have everybody here. And I want to talk about, I know Rosanna, Emily, and Dee typed into the chat specific things they were hoping to get out of this seminar. And also Michael did too. So I'm going to start with Rosanna's. And hers was the question of how to scale up when your organization has had a big hit. Maybe, and I think in her example, if I remember correctly, a major donor stopped the funding because of COVID issues. And I hope that some of these tools can be useful in taking back to your organization and saying, okay, this is the amount of money, the funding that we have lost. This is when we're going to feel the impact of it. And look at that in terms of timing with your programs and see if there's any shorter term grants or other opportunities. Maybe, I don't know the type of organization that you are. Do you have significant donors? Can you do a quick outreach? All of these things. Or and this is the more difficult one, because if, I should say it this way, if your programs and your services align with your strategic goals, there may be a way to then identify which programs have to be cut back. Or, and maybe this is where the idea of volunteers came about, Rosanna, that's absolutely a tool that could be used if it is within the existing funding. So I'm hoping that some of these tools can help your organization to sort of look at it and still protect your organization's highest strategies, your highest goals. Emily asked the question about how do you make budgets fit to your needs? And I guess I think about it in the reverse, by clearly identifying the needs of your organization and then prioritizing them in the context of your strategic plan, in the context of your stakeholder input. You can then develop the budget. You can identify and develop the budget that you need to meet those needs. And if it's clear in developing the budget that certain areas are not going to be adequately funded, then figuring out how do you modify those programs. Sometimes organizations have faced the opposite of what Rosanna's is that suddenly a donor or a grantor brings in significantly more money than you anticipated. Now, what do you do with that? How do you then ensure that it's being used to meet your organization's needs? And again, Emily, I hope that some of these tools, you can see how they might be used to identify the needs and then build the budget from that perspective. Okay, and then D asked the question about in-kind services, which is a little outside of what I had planned to talk about, but I have a couple of minutes, so I just wanted to mention that, yes, in-kind services, obviously in your financial statements, you have to recognize that you're receiving them and that you're using them. And some grant applications specifically request that you report them. Some grant applications say you cannot use them. So you have to modify. Now, some of the difficulty is in tracking volunteer hours or figuring out the dollar value of that. And that is where maybe Michelle and some of the tools that she has can help you figure out how do you cost out, especially when it's people's time for specific purposes. When it's items, that is sometimes much easier to cost out. So Michelle, do you have anything you want to just offer in that area as a resource for D?
Absolutely. And Janet, we always put out for the Nonprofit Institute year after year, the national hourly rate for volunteers comes out, and then the state rates. So we make sure that that goes out in our newsletter so that and it's on our website so that folks can access that if they need it, for example, to calculate their volunteer hours in terms of a monetary amount.
Okay, terrific. Thank you, Michelle.
Janet, can I be a little bit more specific about that as it relates to grants?
Of course,
there were a few grants that we completed where it required a matching gift, and the in-kind donations qualified for that matching gift amount. So we do use a CRM to keep track of the value, so it was more tangible. So it wasn't the volunteer hours we were tracking, it was the actual items. And usually the companies do give us kind of an inventory, so that part is a lot easier, but it was the matching gift portion of it to require for certain funding, and being able, I guess, to put that into the budget moving forward. Sometimes that question catches me off guard. with that and putting it into the narrative. So that's kind of what I meant when I mentioned the not really the tracking of the in-kind donations, but
how do you
presenting.
reflect it as a resource in your application? Is that the
Correct? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, what I have done, and again, every application is so different, but what I have done is actually had a section in terms of, there's usually a section with resources, and I usually talk about the budget numbers and what they're going to be used for and the impact, but then I also include a narrative description of the in-kind and how that's going to impact and support that program. So I actually do use a narrative description. If that application allows for it, I put it in under the section of resources. And that's terrific that some of the grants that you're applying for allow for in-kind. So often the ones I applied for said, yes, we want to know about them, but you can't use them. So that's great. Now, Dee, does that help you does that give you any sort of additional ideas by using
I mean, maybe, because I think one of the someone else mentioned after the first activity, the quantitative versus qualitative reporting. I think that's kind of where we are. I think if there was a space where you could demonstrate intrinsic impact versus numerical, because a lot of times when they ask for impact, they usually go for, organizations that say, we fed 3 million people in 3 months with $5, but that's just not the business that we're in. Right. The value that we attach to what it is we do is more intrinsic, and it's multiple touches to the same person, as opposed to, let's do something for all of these people. So demonstrating that intrinsic value along with the in-kind donations. So just by trade, I'm a fundraiser. And so a lot of times when some of these grants come out, they don't take all of these things into consideration. And so I'm just trying to find ways to force this information in. So it's almost like, you've not thought of this, but I feel like I have to share this with you so that it'll make up for those other numbers that you're possibly looking for. Yeah, because we do have a budget that's over $50,000 or $100,000, but that's not cash money. That definitely includes, and the reason why we solicit in-kind donations is so that we can use the dollars for the things that we can't, do. So your point of adding it into the narrative without making it seem like we're not answering the question that they asked is the challenge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Dee, and I think it was Tora who mentioned this exact issue in terms of impact. And it's almost an art form, grant writing, I think, figuring out where. I teach a class on what's basically budget justification. How do you defend? How do you argue strongly for your budget? It's figuring out in the constraints of the budget application places that might be that you can put it in, and obviously it is in the narrative. You don't want to ignore the directions, but there are places that you can hopefully find and beef it up. And like I said, on the in-kind, where I found my opportunity was most of the grants asked for a narrative describing the resources and how they were going to support that program. And that's where I took my opportunity. Tora, I see your hand is raised, so go right ahead.
Yes, one thing that, you have mentioned it in your presentation, one thing that the state does, they have quarterly meetings. Mm-hmm. And I just really soak in everything that they say. And I go back and I say, well, how can I address what they have mentioned? And so I mean, fortunately, this funder, you know, they host these meetings. And then there are like 23 other institutions that are involved in this meeting. And we brainstorm, as you mentioned, you know, bounce off ideas, as you mentioned. And, but I just try to look at the resources that we have to meet the needs of what they are saying, the stakeholders or the funder is saying. And I include that information. So I have those conversations with them a lot. I mean, a lot, even outside of those meetings. And fortunately, they also provide technical assistance, and where I can bounce off, you know, ideas and ask for suggestions. But you mentioned that during your presentation, as far as including them in the conversation and when you're creating those budgets and so forth. But I try to do that as much as possible. And I don't take for granted with one of the grants that I manage, I have been managing for 7 years, but I don't take for granted that when I approach the grant each year, because I have to apply for it each year, I don't take for granted what I have done previously. And so I just had those frequent conversations. I mean, frequent.
Yeah, and Tora, thank you so much, because you are describing this value of communications, the value of understanding the grantors and where they're coming from. What are they wanting to achieve with their funding? The more information, whether it's from a county, city, private foundation, that information is so critical, because as you said, then you know where they're coming from, how you want to sort of present your budget, present your grant proposal. It gives you much more information. It's not a one-way street. It's a two-way street and two-way communication. So that's just terrific. So thank you so much for sharing your experience. And I would highly recommend that. I also just want to follow up on your point about not taking for granted what you've already gotten in prior years. That is a terrific point, because I've had situations where the city actually changed the grant application process. It wasn't the same. They were not looking for the same thing. And if you were just taking for granted, oh, we've gotten the money every year, so we're just going to do our narrative and update it for this year's. No, it's going to those meetings, it's reading those instructions really clearly and making sure that your narrative and your application fits to what they're wanting. So yeah, also sometimes not taking it for granted helps you, encourages your organization to update reevaluate at that time while you're doing your grant application. So good. Now, I saw a question, and I know we're getting close to time. We have just a few more minutes, but I saw Terry asked a question that said, so we can convert our in-kind time to match. And I'm going to say, and I'll let Michelle take over on this, it depends on the grant application. I know I keep saying that, but it is so, the ones that Dee is applying for, absolutely, she's able to do that. The ones that I was able to do, I had to report it. I had to figure out the volunteer time and the cost of that, what we were getting, but we couldn't use it as part of our matching. Right. So Michelle, do you want to add on to anything I'm saying?
Agreed, Janet. Usually you don't see that opportunity, but I loved your suggestion in talking to Dee and what Dee was saying about incorporating that into the narrative if you can. So for example, if you are utilizing some space from another community partner, you might want to be able to say, part of the reason that we can so successfully leverage some of the funding that we receive is because we are offered this in-kind space. So it's how you write it into the narrative to make sure you can weave it in without seeming like you're jamming it down their throats, if that's helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, like I said, it's an art. And it's so specific, and I'm sorry if I'm giving you some generic answers, but it's so specific to that grant application, as Tora was saying, you know, and even the grant application process can change one year to the next. So are there any other questions? Now, I don't know if Michael, you are still here. I would be really interested, sort of as closing thought, to hear from you of whether anything that we've talked about today could help your organization, maybe not now, but in the future. Do you have any final thoughts on that, Michael?
It made me realize, I think it shows me the sky's the limit, but I need some more membership. People, I don't know, I was sharing with one of the group, about 80% of our group are between ages 70 and 80. And we need some more younger people that have more energy. And I'm not saying nothing bad about the members that they've been there 15 years or so. But I think the sky's the limit if I can find some more people that willing to commit and have the energy to really commit to that, including myself. I'm pretty close to that age, so somebody might need to replace me, but we need to, I think, look for a different pool of people that's willing to grow and help the organization grow.
Yeah, and you know, my one thought is a great place to start is maybe having a community meeting. You know, inviting school students or whoever. What would they want this Juneteenth celebration to be for them to get interested and involved? I mean, that's just the starting point question. Not
happy with the Juneteenth results, but I'm thinking of going to some more avenues, and other things. I'm convinced we have a pretty good crew for our Juneteenth, but I think maybe looking in another direction to do other things.
Yeah, so maybe starting just having conversations with your community. Is a place to start. But I'm so glad, I love to hear the words, the sky's the limit. We just have to open up your thinking. That's exactly what I was hoping to get out of, helping everyone would get out of this. Okay, so I want to thank you all so much. I've really enjoyed having this opportunity. And I hope that you've learned a couple of things. I am going to share the PowerPoint with Michelle, and that you'll have it available, and it will also have my email. I am in the process of launching my organization's website in the next week or so that will be available. And so please stay in touch, and if you have questions about anything I talked about, feel free to reach out to me. All right, and that contact info again will be on the PowerPoint. So, Michelle, is there anything else?
Yes. Thank you, Janet, for an excellent seminar. We really appreciate the information about the strategic budget process and the tools. Fantastic. And thank you for everyone who joined us today, for your questions and your interactivity. We are so appreciate it. Please look for an email. It's likely to come out on Monday. It's going to contain participation certificates that St. Mary's nonprofits need, showing that they participated today. It's also going to have the survey, as well as Janet's PowerPoint, and then we also will upload the entire presentation to the website. So, and she has also a handout as well that I will attach to that. So it'll all come in one email. Thank you again to our co-sponsors, the College of Southern Maryland, the Maryland Governor's Grants Office, and Charles, St. Mary's, and Calvert Public Libraries. Everyone have a wonderful day, and remember that the sky's the limit.
And thank you, everybody. I really enjoyed it. Take good care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, Michelle.
Bye, Janet. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. I'll be in touch via email.
Very good.
Okay.
Thank you, Janet.
Oh,
This is
thank you.
This is Kara. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for your technical support. Appreciate it. And Robin, have a great weekend. Let's see if I think there was.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
I enjoyed it
All right.
very much.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that. I hope it gave you food for thought. Okay. Bye-bye.